This is how I spent a lot of my time as a kid, in the unfinished side of the basement on an outdated Windows XP Dell with a 4x3 screen that would go yellow unless you smacked it just right. It was the only other source of light outside of the high, glass block windows down there. There was no Club Penguin or RuneScape for me. I entirely missed the boom of those MMO likes, and similarly was much too awkward to have any regrettable MySpace pages either. Instead, I was content to burn my eyes out playing free or budget PC games alone. I'm talking randomly clicking on Minesweeper for 5 minutes and batting wildly on pinball for 5 minutes, failing miserably at backyard football for longer, making the most nonsensical layouts in Zoo Tycoon 2, downloading sketchy game services and carefully rationing the time-limited trial of some of the demos, and towering above the rest as the most formative gaming experience of my entire young life was RollerCoaster Tycoon 2. I have no idea how the game came into my household. It was likely a result of my older brother getting excited at some display case somewhere. I just know that in the CD rack attached to that slowly dilapidating wooden desk was the second entry in Chris Sawyer's Masterpiece series. As all the others came and went, with increasingly better graphics and styles, or simply when their timer was up, this one remained with its antiquated but charming visuals, and the oddness glimpsed through them. This world is an almost liminal space with so many questions. Why is this chunk of land just floating in a void? Where do all these guests come from, and why will they spend years of their life and their entire savings throwing money into ride tickets? Powerless to resist the edict of God, which is a no-entry sign that can be made to exist in this purgatory forever, shambling back and forth and thinking only one thing: I want to go home, back into the void and out of existence forever. But the game is odd in that almost metaphysical way, odd when you look outside of the boundaries and question what's beyond the game's scope. Sure, there are some things that make little sense. I mean, how does a dinghy slide literally explode, like actually combusting as a bomb would from hitting the ground? Did MF Thatherton convince them that propane was the best gas to inflate these things with? But honestly, that's a detail I feel like it was just too funny to remove from the game. It's still funny to this day, the way it so abruptly transitions from like, oh, this thing is gonna bounce when it hits the ground, to just kaboom, literal fire. It's like perfect subversion of expectations. There are a few things like this in the game that are less comical and more just off, but in terms of how you actually interact with this world, it has a structure which feels sensible. If you don't hire someone to take out the trash, it's gonna build up, and then guests will leave and stay away because that's actually disgusting. If you have no one to inspect your rides, then they're gonna break down more often, and that downtime will have the same effect as the trash. Would you like it if you went to an amusement park and your favorite rides were all not working? Build 20 paths going off in random directions and never connecting? People are going to get lost, get angry, and pan your rating. Actions have logical consequences, and you can easily determine what you need to do in a predictable way. Your goal is to build a successful theme park, and you're presented with options for a successful theme park. Mostly you just have to use them. Hire handymen, hire mechanics, build a grid-ish enough pattern, and explore the menus to find your other management aspects. Think normally, like what you would want from an amusement park, and you're probably going to succeed. At least, well, you should be able to, but kid me never actually grasped this fact. I was encountering everything about the game which should have told me this, and, well, I just ignored it all. I would create absolute messes where garbage could only be thrown on the path because there were no cans, where no one could sit down without any benches, where every single roller coaster would snap your neck and so no one rode them, if I wasn't just placing down presets most of the time. Which, I mean, those were pretty much the only ones they could ride because they had inbuilt queue lines, and, well, I just didn't put those down on any other rides. If you just think with basic real-world logic, everything wrong with these parks I built would be painfully obvious, but that wasn't my concern. I just wanted to build the pretty things and make them fit in a nice spot. I sincerely think that the isometric view actually just satisfied my need for right angles and organization, like this, right here. Most satisfying thing in the world. So I would just load up a new game, take out the maximum loan, build everything I wanted to, and then quit once the money ran dry. Somewhere out there are 100 alternative realities of Crazy Castle, functioning at about 5% capacity because of kid me. there were only 2 finished scenarios across all the years me and my brother played. 1 electric fields from him, and that 1 in 100 crazy castle from me. Now, a lot of changes happened to give my history of playing the game a little bit of a gap. Broken PC, shinier consoles, 357 hours of Pokemon Diamond, life-consuming relationships. The point is, I had a bit of a break from the game. Now, I can't actually remember what specifically brought me in anymore, but sometime about 9 years ago, the theme park builder had a revival in Planet Coaster and Parkitect, which likely had some influence. Seeing my favorite YouTubers cover those games left me wanting them, but being broke, I just opted to go for the original instead. With the right sale, it hardly cost me anything to get, and I was back in, sitting at the kitchen table with a tiny 2000 mouse I stole from school, designing theme parks after class once again. I wasn't great, as this super high quality video of me playing in 2017 can attest to, but I still had enough common sense to actually beat scenarios. I intuited that, yes, maybe trash cans would be a good thing to include in an amusement park, and seating probably was too. If you want people to be able to ride your rides, well, maybe that long-standing human knowledge of designate a line to wait in would probably help a lot as well. And those rides the lines were for, well, maybe they shouldn't cause death. That doesn't seem like a successful business plan, so I finally, actually looked at the stats tab and figured maybe I should lower the speed around those bends. At least sometimes I did. I want to say that as an adult I learned how to play the game, but it was more like I learned common sense. Unlike so many other games, I never needed to Google walkthroughs or locations or how a certain mechanic worked. Anything I needed an answer to, I really just had to imagine how would this function in a real park, and that's it. You need big and exciting rides to get people in, although advertising can do the same. The price can be adjusted depending on all of that and increase or decrease over time, but a variety of rides, food, and drink will make people happier and help raise those numbers. Just things like that. The game backed this up in subtle ways, most notably the guests' thoughts and actions, and the general stats menu for the park's rides and stalls. They could think a ride was too expensive or even too cheap. If it was for weenies or for absolute mad people, they could leave the queue if it was just too damn long, and a range of emotions would either make them stay or leave the park, which could be obviously altered by food, drink, bathrooms, and so on. They would be carrying trash from different stalls, so there was clearly some preference there, and having favorite rides reinforced the same thing. They can't have a favorite without variety mattering, so I gave my park as much of it as possible. And finally, I was actually succeeding. All it took was, thinking about what a park should really look like in real life. Except, some of what I just said isn't actually required. For as much as it seemed like variety mattered, and for how much that genuinely altered the way I played the game and strove to make as interesting a park as possible, variety means actually nothing in the game's code. It only affects what you can charge for a certain ride type by a small amount, and then some awards that you can get as well, but those are a very minor part of the game. What felt so important was actually, on the whole, meaningless. I started to uncover this fact when I went back to the old classic, Crazy Castle, where most of my memories of the game are stored. Of course, there are rides I like to build and ones that I don't. That whole thing of really just liking the right angles and organization, yeah, that's always held true, so I tended to use a lot of flat rides, throw some basic theming, and then intersperse the roller coasters after a bit of that. Building them less often, there were some I hardly touched, like the log flume. Technically a water ride, but designed by you like a coaster. However, at some point in this crazy castle run, everything else was already used up, so variety called and it was the log flume's time to shine. Starting to place the track, building that hill closer to the walls, it felt kind of similar. And if I put it right here in this little cutout, well, that was a spot that felt almost perfect, successful even. And as I really sat with it, I remembered that this is where I'd placed one as a kid, and it stood out to me because it was the one time where I actually beat a scenario. All thanks to a log flume like this. Up, turn, down, turn, and end. That's it. Let's be clear, this isn't really a realistic design, at least as far as I know from my local park. There is something like it, but that would be under a different ride type, the splash boats, which are meant to be more of a one up, one down, done, that's it, with a lot more guests on it. Here we call it the Pittsburgh Plunge. Now, the log flume is more of a snaking path, a few ups and downs in a smaller form with a decent drop to finish, but nothing like one up, one down. And that's because the point of the ride is a log flume. It's like you're riding a log down a river. It's supposed to be more of that winding path. I had taken the latter and used it to make the former, which really just shouldn't be that great. Maybe okay, but not prop up an entire park and be the uncontested best ride levels. And yet, in this run, it definitely was. At first I had it set to a low cost, but guests would keep thinking Log Flume 1 was really good value, and I kept increasing the price until people stopped thinking this as they kept riding and money kept pouring in, at least with respect to what I normally made my first ever ride to charge more than a couple dollars. This let me avoid bankruptcy, I think, considering that I sold all of the scenery around the park to supplement as well, and that let me keep building rides, which raised the number of guests I could get, and with enough handymen to make up for the lack of bins, the rating stayed just high enough that I reached and held the 1,500 guest goal by the end of the scenario, with a few no entry signs by the exit, just in case, of course. That garbage log flume propped up an entire park, something that I never noticed as a kid because, well, I was much too excited to just beat in a scenario for once, but thinking back as an adult, it felt so strange in a way the game never had before. Most things operated logically. That is, I didn't have to question why they did or didn't work, but this one left me wondering, wanting to test. Was I remembering right? Would it work again all these years later, or was it just something that I didn't remember that had done it? And, well, it did. So I knew that, but I needed more info to know why, and so what about 2? Would that work? And it did. So it wasn't location or the lack of other expensive enough rides. In fact, it was even better with 2 of them, with guests happily bouncing back and forth between them as if it wasn't a total ripoff. I thought variety mattered, yet here they were labeling one of 2 identical rides as somehow more favorite than the other. Of course, they were just bits of code, always had been, but they usually did just enough to feel somewhat logical, real in the way that old games were limited so you gave them leeway. Yet here the guests were being so undeniably stupid. So what about 3 flumes? Does that change anything? 4, 8, 16? Nothing changed. No matter how many of the same exact log flume I placed, the guests were willing to happily keep paying and riding, even draining their savings account in an ATM just to keep repeating the same what should have been awful experience. Mindless drones simply fulfilling loops of code and offering the simple idea that it was something more with pure aesthetics, thoughts that were just flavor text. The once grand illusion of this game's reality had been shattered. I didn't ever need to do half the stuff I was convinced was required. And if logic didn't matter here, well, where else was that the case? And it turns out, pretty much everywhere, you can beat the hardest scenarios of the second game with just Ferris wheels. You can beat one which needs 10 lengthy coasters in just 60 tiles. You can beat almost any with the simple setup of just a few tiles, and hell, you can beat the whole game without guests ever riding a single ride. The most successful way to play the game doesn't look like a whimsical land of interlocking loops and stunning scenery, but the same small ride again and again and again and again and again. This is what it looks like to break reality. When one crack shows and human curiosity takes over, where you realize that the limitations were never from this world, they were from yourself. And now, without them, you're left in absolute freedom to wonder what's next. So far, this was mostly my story on uncovering that this occurs, but maybe more interesting, and actually applicable to a more important situation than a video game, is why I felt like there was such a carefully crafted reality to break in the first place. Why did I limit myself? Well, the short answer is that the game is optimized. Sawyer didn't code what he didn't have to because the player's intent and simple suggestion handles a lot of that for him. Why take up limited PC power all the time doing something that you can pretty much assume the player's just going to do anyway? For example, let's look at how guests decide which food stall to eat from. We want as few variables as possible, so we make a line of a few different items, popcorn, hot dogs, hamburgers, and so on, and we expect that, while AI trying to seem more real, either pick randomly or maybe go based on some behind-the-scenes inherent dice roll like IVs in Pokemon. Either way, they should clearly spread out, and they don't. They all just go for the closest stall, and that's it. So a quick clarification for this. If you look at a video like this, you will see this test working properly, where it is that stark 100% to 0% contrast. My tests, being less ideal, did not have that, but you can still see the principle working, that even with those that variance of a few unknowns going on, the test not being exactly perfect, that the closest stall is still seeing a vast majority of the customers. And so the principle still is visible in my tests, just not as clear as you might see it in some other ones. Well, for science's sake, we have to reverse things and see if somehow they all just wanted to get that one specifically, not just because it was the closest. And rerunning it, we see that they simply go to the nearest one still. Undeniably, this is how they're choosing. And in fact, it's even dumber because time or path length isn't a consideration at all. It's simply distance in raw tiles. If we had a hooked path that they have to traverse around, they all skip past the actual closest and just go to the one which looked closest. They just hit a threshold to act on hunger, find the nearest stall, head for it, and even if they pass another one while making the trek, keep going for it. This is what it feels like when you listen to Google Maps telling you where to go. Instead of just taking the direct path, it winds you around highways, up and around, and all this crazy stuff, to then end up saving you like maybe 30 seconds and wasting a lot more gas. It's just one of those things that feels nonsensical. I don't even think that we can call that a decision. That's literally just like 4th grade math. How did this game ever feel real? Well, it's because the game gave me just enough evidence to believe this, assuming that it's what I wanted to believe. The just enough evidence comes from the ways where the park actually does need coded limitations. Take the state of paths affecting guest happiness, which affects the park rating as a consequence. Let trash pile up and bins overflow, and guests will start to think this path is disgusting, which slowly applies those consequences the longer they're in that state. However, it is a bit forgiving in that the feeling can also fade if they leave a particularly dirty area, say next to a very nauseating ride, for a much cleaner one. If that's the case, that you just overlooked a bit or added a new variable, then instead what you get is just an indicator. Click on some guests with that thought to find the location, drop a handyman there, maybe a first aid stall, and you're probably good. It shows you that there will be consequences, but also that they can be easily removed if you just do this simple thing. I mean, the game even tells you exactly what to do in the warning. Just use the options it presents you. That's it. Now, that same thought process can apply to non-important aspects of the game, like variety. That's all about using the options in the menus. I mean, literally, that's what it is. As a kid, I was placed an entertainer and a security guard because they might do something being right next to those two important roles, right? Like I thought, guests might be stealing rides if I didn't have a security guard nearby or something like that. And when you open menus similar to that, the guest thoughts, and see that some rides are more popular, and that they'll even have a specific favorite ride, well, it reinforces the same thing. That call out wouldn't be there for nothing in this important menu, right? These imagined needs are never called out, but it feels like they could be, and it's an easier step to just say, I'll put one down just in case, rather than I'll fail and find out. There's no satisfaction in the latter. By having unimportant systems paired with and mimicking the important ones, the idea is in your head, and you'll do the rest of the limitation yourself. No code required. Now, there is an obvious issue with this though, which is that if someone does happen to just throw a bunch of stalls together in a row, it will become obvious and break that all-important illusion of reality. Except, no one's ever actually going to do that. Most parks won't look like this, but like this, with either stalls spread throughout or 2 to 3 in little chunks. Why is that? Well, because you're booting up a game by choice to have a fun time with it. This isn't work or school or something you have to do. It is your relaxation in the time after all those things. So your intent is not to be efficient. If anything, it's the opposite, to have fun. And out of everything you could choose to do that with, you're choosing a game called RollerCoaster Tycoon, which is expressly about designing a theme park. chances are if you bought and then opened that game, you want to design what feels like a cool theme park by default, which means you'll do what feels representative of that. And would you want to go to a park with the same ride over and over? Why would you spend time making something that doesn't actually satisfy you? Even while playing the game, during this writing process, I never questioned, should I make another ride that I already have, but instead always put down a new one without even thinking about it. Why wouldn't I? This is my super cool, awesome park, and I want variety in it. There's no one coming in with the intent to make a terrible, unfun park, so any code against that is just wasted processing and memory space. Plus, it makes simple code seem complex. The decision process doesn't have any randomness to it because you are the randomness. Once again, anything the player can be assumed to provide is redundant. This design around intent is also why bins and handymen have consequences and a lack of variety doesn't. Even though both are aspects of a real functional park, one is a need to and one is a desire to. While everyone wants to rush right to making their magnum opus coaster, the less flashy things might need a little reminder or a nudge in the right direction. As you get lost in that designing, which, believe me, that can happen, you'll just forget about the more management aspects of the park while you're off building the next greatest coaster, that little warning pulls you back in and reminds you that there are some limitations here, that this space isn't just imagination, but something better. You fighting to make your imagination real, fending off those low ratings and those lost guests to make sure that your vision is seen through. This is why there are elements of realism at all, because they're a part of the game's challenge, the drive for you to try new things and do better. It felt important enough for me to create via the game's suggestion because I didn't just want a sandbox to be a child playing with random toys and dropping them 5 minutes later. I wanted success, at least at this point in my life. As much as player intent is about fun, it's also about satisfaction. So those coded have-tos and uncoded want-tos are really quite an elegant system. One rewarding our intent, and the other playing off of it to help create that reward in the first place. Plus, if you do add a system of negative consequences for this, that means you're simply punishing someone's intent to have fun in an interesting way, more than likely. Say you really like pretzels, and a pretzel-themed park sounds cool to you, so you make a bunch of tight coasters with contained twists and turns, and all your stalls are pretzel stalls. That's a unique and creative idea, even if it doesn't have variety. If we imagine the reality being crafted here, it's the assumption that the guests are choosing to enter a park called Pretzel Land, which is all about pretzels. And so them complaining about the lack of variety would actually break the illusion of their choice, not create it. And that's the thing, the realism of the game is entirely crafted by the player's intent. And so the best thing you can do is not inhibit that intent, even if it seems intuitive to. Allowing everything, but suggesting a few things is the best way to make that something happen, to let someone think that they did the thing well. When we choose to implement this solution or to do something creative, to add variety which actually means nothing, we'll look at that high rating, the success, and go, well, it's probably all the different types of rides that I built and decided to use, and keep doing it. That element of the control that we feel, even though it's over nothing, directs the player exactly because from that they'll never see that it's over nothing. Before we go even further though, we have to understand that a big part of what makes this player-created realism work is that it's around intuitive elements. We don't have to study to understand that human beings enjoy a variety of rides to choose from. We just know from being human that they do. We don't have to be told that if a garbage can is a block away, you're probably not running over to it. We know because we don't. Without any dedicated thought, we can make these assumptions of realism and apply them to the game. But designing a roller coaster isn't intuitive. The average person isn't an engineer, or even someone who understands physics more than up will go down. We're just silly, excitable little meatbags who think roller coasters are cool and want to make something super fast and intense, and then any thoughts of G-force come well afterwards. Just think about all the times as a kid where you designed the Spine Crusher 3000 with little more thought than Big Hill is cool and also means fast, and fast is also cool. Cool is a desire to, forces are a need to. Plus, this isn't just applied to a standard design, but to many. There are a lot of coaster types, specific track pieces for each, special elements, unique ride times and speeds, and even more, all of which needs to be calculated. With all that unintuitive complexity, if you just sit someone down and say design a coaster, it'll probably be either very unexciting or very overly intense. Hell, it might even fail to finish before that point, and to have a bunch of guests busting out of the queue line for something like this, well, that wouldn't feel very real. And neither would watching them zip around a bend at neck-cracking speed or be comfortable with a 20-minute long ride. I think what shows this best is what the franchise has become. Look at the newer games where any design works and will get ridden. This immediately pulls you out of the game. Your actions clearly don't matter, so why are you actually taking them? It rewards you just as much for slapping down a flat circle or a spaghetti junction as much as an actually good design, and so our shortcut-loving brains will look for something else which can validate it's more than just, thanks for booting up, you win. What this is all getting at is that player-created realism won't work with such an unintuitive system. To make coasters feel real, you need to teach people to make better designs with calculations and limitations. This is of course what RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 does. Each ride has an equation which considers things like time, length, number of drops, g-force speed, and so on to return a value which determines its price point and rideability. This means you can't just slap down a small circle of track and have it be rated well. But almost everything you do makes the numbers go up, so go too far and a weighted value could easily render the entire equation unrealistically rideable, but yet ridden anyway. For example, more length means more excitement, and so a coaster which is just 5 minutes of slow moving forward would get at least somewhat decent stats from length. The equation alone is vulnerable. And so we have stat requirements, a sort of hard limit on these extremes. Like how a wooden coaster needs to meet these or its stats will be cut in half. At least 2 drops, one of those drops to be at least 9 meters, reach a speed of at least 36 kilometers and a length of at least 370 meters with at least 0.1 negative Gs somewhere. Miss any of these and the ride will be very unfavorable, so your long, slow circle is trash. There are also general ones, such as excessive G-forces for any rides which have them, cutting stats if these numbers are reached. These two systems in tandem, the equation and the requirements applied afterwards, are what keep the coasters in reality by making them what we would expect, but don't ourselves create in real life. A wooden coaster should be a general all-around coaster, so it has many averages to meet. A chain ride doesn't need drops, but we expect it to be long, so it has a length requirement. A wild mouse is, well, wild, so it needs to hit a higher level of G's rather than any certain length. Whatever you think a ride should be, these are there to make you build it the way you imagine. And to bolster our earlier discussion, these also serve as another example of reward, which is only possible with a fail state, the motivation which keeps us playing. This is a pretty good system. It's a little bit complex, but we have the intent to do well, the tools to do so, and motivation for days, so we'll improve and never notice the ways it can be messy. Except that's assuming the system is without mistakes, and no system with calculations like this can go without them. This is another reason why the uncoded and simply coded nature of many RCT functions is so genius. The more code you have, the more errors you have. The logic of this is pretty simple. Each new requirement means new functions which can have mistakes, new variables which can have mistakes, new calculations which can have mistakes, and interaction between each new thing and already existing systems which can then multiply all of that. The chance of something being wrong increases with each thing designated as possibly being right, which means more chances for the player to watch that all-important reality break. This is likely what happened with me and the log flume to kick this all off. While I would expect a real-world log flume to be decent length and have a few drops, the only stat requirement for the log flume is to have one single drop of only 4 meters. That alone wouldn't be enough to make it so out of place. And after all, you still have speed and forces to consider in that overall stat equation, except you don't. Even though it builds like a coaster, it's a water ride, and water rides don't have G-forces. Plus, its selection of track pieces is very limited. Yes, with a couple special elements, but the actual track design itself has very little room to reward creativity. So what you're left with is an equation which can be manipulated by single variables without real restriction. One drop which can make the entire thing a good enough ride. With all these types of tracked rides and all these requirements for them, it's only natural that one of them would slip through the cracks and feel a bit off. Or a couple as the Heartline Twister Coaster could be just as good an example, either a glaring oversight or the direct object of all of Chris Sawyer's hate with how terrible it is. Whatever the case, these mistakes are then reinforced in playtesting, as whoever's testing it will already be influenced to try and design something good from the player-created realism, and then from having to test so many things, not get around to every single one in depth. Some will continue to slip through. That hard complexity allowed human error to come into play and create a little space of oddity, a conflict with expectation where you can go, that's weird. And from there, our pattern-loving brains will want to find the pattern. Why is it weird? We'll test, poke, and prod here and there, copy the same ride or flip the path side, suddenly not designing a park within reality, but testing reality. And once that happens, the all-important player intent has now changed. The complex becomes simple, the challenging becomes easy, and much of what the game does just falls apart. This is the one glaring flaw with this kind of system. A single error can take down the entire thing. One oddity can break what we know of reality. We really see this with the most abusable aspect of this reality, when the game actively tries to enforce a certain mechanic. In this case, let's look at the way it justifies different coaster types. Because at the end of the day, these are basically just reskins of the same code, which of course is a good thing. It's the variety which we assume is important and which makes the game so fun. But some of them are quite similar to each other because there's only so much you can do with track pieces in an isometric view. They'll often have different trains to distinguish things, and maybe the supports look different and so on, all reinforcing this variety. But another option is with special elements, track pieces outside of the normal options. Open the special menu and you're greeted with a few usual ones, like helixes or S-bends, and maybe something like a loop or a corkscrew as well, signature pieces for specific rides. That's most of what justifies these being truly separate things, and as such would validate the variety and realism by keeping you from seeing it as something too similar. So the game wants you to use these for the realism and importance of your decisions, and actually has a sort of reverse stat requirement in place for some of those special elements. Effectively, each use greatly raises the stats. This makes sense. You want people to notice differences between it and other similar varieties, not let them make the same design on each type, so you reward them when they do so. Increased stats reinforce that they'll use the unique element again. But how is this done? Because it's a pretty strange case. You obviously can't have bonuses apply multiple times, or else suddenly something like this is suddenly highly rated, so it's limited to one each. On something like the log flume, which has a specific special element like the reverser, or at least I think it's pretty specific to it, you can have a small bonus, and that can be all because it doesn't need to stand out from similar rides. There was only one kind of log flume. For these coasters, that's not really enough distinction though, just a plus 0.2 to your ratings here and there. So what can you do without redesigning the whole system for a few fringe cases? Well, you could bypass those requirements in this specific case instead of applying the specific case to them all. If you use at least one corkscrew element on the corkscrew coaster, then all other stat requirements are voided. A similar thing happens for other ride types, like the looping coaster and its loops. This is a very optimized solution, but also one which is open to abuse because now you don't need any number of drops or lengths or anything to get the base stats. The game dealing with its own complex system of realism is what means entirely unrealistic designs, like this one, become seen by the guests as perfectly acceptable coasters. Perfectly acceptable coasters which can bring in the entire cost it took to build them within a minute or so because they have a decent price and process guests in no time at all. You get good stats for no cost and no footprint, and suddenly there's an aggressively optimized way to play the game. A park with only this coaster will be more successful than almost any other. This is my log flume discovery, taken to the extreme by much better players, and it really showcases that the times where the game tries to exert the most control over the player are the best opportunities to break it. Make us do something and we won't, but guide us there without ever saying it, and we'll take pride in doing so. Humans, right? This all gets to its most interesting when we consider how this all comes together. Take those little reality-breaking elements and combine them. What can be created then? How far can this reality be pressed? We see this with setups like this. one which can beat just about any RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 scenario through abusing multiple of these mechanics in ways outside of normal intent. Let's run through what should be the issues and then how they're bypassed. First of all is overcrowding, which is clearly happening here. In normal play, this is one of the things that can tank your rating damn quickly if you don't have enough path to accommodate the guests. Whenever I see that warning of overcrowding, I immediately start building more paths and getting it more connected into a grid shape. But if we check their thoughts here in what should be the worst overcrowding ever, not a single guest is complaining about it. Why is that? Well, because overcrowding is only determined when they move between tiles, because why would guests ever not be doing so in a normal park? For an optimized decision, overcrowding is simply never checked in this setup, so there's nothing to reduce happiness and lower the rating. Speaking of reduced happiness, you'll see a lack of both any kind of drink and also any kind of bathroom here, which feels like it should be an issue. Being thirsty and having your bladder about to burst for like a year should reduce your happiness and make you want to cross the threshold to leave. But not if there's a man in a funny suit next to you. Entertainers function through a shortcut just like path conditions, raising the happiness of any guest on their current tile by a little bit, which in normal play would average out to a very slight boost in overall happiness due to random physical distribution. But if you have isolated tiles that they're all just bouncing back and forth on, then each entertainer is constantly raising the happiness of the entire park all at once, and this easily counteracts the happiness reduction from, well, anything. No happiness drop occurs, and your rating is maintained. There is a food stall, which is there to counteract the energy drain on guests, a potential source of them wanting to go home. It seems like energy should just lower over time, but it only does so when the guest is over a certain amount of hunger, which they will always correct if they pass or are near a food stall. And since one is right there, they never actually enter the range of losing energy. The food does produce trash, but a handyman sweeps an entire tile at once, because why would 1,000 pieces of trash ever be on the same tile at once? So a single handyman can handle literally 1,000 people worth of garbage in this situation. And some items, like the hot dog stall used here, don't even produce trash to begin with, so a handyman isn't necessary. And for stranger reasons, an entertainer actually isn't either. It seems that the guests are happy enough just from buying things. And then lack of cash never matters because of the low costs, so empty pockets never make the guests want to leave. But you still make just enough that you never run out of money for advertising, which is required to generate guests without other rides, because of course, advertising doesn't check your park, it just dumps people in. Why would it need to if someone was playing right? Now, why aren't the guests choosing to leave from having not ridden a ride in so long though? Well, this is something that they actually do, but only for 5 minutes. Because assuming normal play, all you really need to do is check that a single ride is accessible and desirable, and if someone did that once within 5 minutes, then there are probably many more. Why waste processing power checking their intent again? Just have the guest head for a ride, and other factors like energy and happiness will take care of the rest if it's inaccessible. But of course, we're counteracting that all. And that's what makes this setup work. A coalescence of all these mechanics optimized around player intent. A stunning showcase of just how much of this fantastic game's sense of reality is based on the most unrealistic principles. It almost feels like we should be upset by this to some degree, right? Like, doesn't this absurd setup destroy this whole beautiful reality? It's sort of like a curse of knowledge deal, where once you know, you can't help but see it differently than before. As a kid just fumbling around with the mechanics and having no idea of how it works at all, of course you just fail, but it was still fun each time coming back for the same failure. There just wasn't any need for success yet, no knowledge that we measure ourselves by limits, so just playing it all was fine. And then becoming an adult, we are aware of this, but now we get something out of that at least. We slowly start to succeed, ticking off those scenarios to unlock new ones and feeling like we actually did something. We improved, grew up from that silly child. Look at this real feeling park. And then to learn that none of it actually mattered. All we really learned was how to be happy by letting ourselves be tricked. It's like a puzzle with 1,000 solutions. Sure, the boundary, those edge pieces have to be made the same way, but every other piece can just go wherever. So did your choice to put it right there ever matter, ever mean anything about you or to you? Once you know, the magic just feels lost. Except by technicality, it can't be. Since it was from us in the first place, we can't lose it. We can only decide whether to give it or not. So what if we just choose to give it in some other way? If the game won't challenge us as is, well then let's make it something different since we made it fun to begin with. It's inside of us all along, we just need to let it out. The important thing to remember is that there are real limits here. Not just the game's code, but the game's code. Like code itself is limited. It can only do what a computer does. It can only exist in the size of memory available. You can't put 100,000 guests in a park because the game would crash. That's a hard limit. What we do to choose fun is to break out of these soft limits we were told and try to find the hard ones we weren't told. Confined not by tricks, but by the simple reality of the world, much broader space to define things within our choice. For example, sure, X guests and Y time can be nice, but what about build the smallest park possible to do so? The tile is a hard limit after all. The game can't be broken down to anything smaller than that ride-wise, so how few of them can you use, measuring your success against, well, the very code itself? That's what led to the setup we covered already, which then from this information being shared and the desire to push those limits being strong was reduced even further to this, a still smaller footprint with a lot more effort to make it work. In some cases, it goes even smaller than this, scenarios without a time limit being beaten by nothing more than a single stall and some AI unfortunate enough to have a bad cycle time overlap between their walk and the game clock. It goes from this all the way down to this. That's not sad, that's goddamn amazing. That's growth being defined not by limits told to us, but by real limits that we choose to find. And so they're stronger, more meaningful, more unique, building specific communities and spreading entertainment. Because these challenges, these tiles, most profit, highest speed, they extend beyond the game even. That's how I know this all in the first place. The information in this video all came from one YouTube channel, Marcel Voss. I guess I should say the information came from a few places, as he sometimes credits others in the community, but much of it is his work, and my source of it all has been through him, even directly a bit. I reached out to him a year ago now asking for input, and the thoughtful response he gave me helped to take what was a rushed and awful script and see that it needed to be something much better. I'm glad I got that email back, because if not, it would have been a truly horrible video on something truly special to me, and that's a regret I would hate. So I have some deep thanks to give there. For me and many others, his videos have been an inspiration to get back into and majorly improve at an old favorite, providing strategies that just make the game a lot more fun. And this is all by his choice to have one less imagined limit, that this kind of hyper-specific interest wouldn't be, well, interesting to others. I don't play the game anything like his videos. I use a lot less optimization, and I'm not that interested in running these game-breaking experiments myself. However, I do think that seeing someone else do so has such an entertainment value because it's almost like an expression of absurdism, which is something I do engage heavily with. I mean, it's thousands of simple AI trudging back and forth endlessly. No water, no bathroom, no rest, and yet never stopping, bound to the one goal set upon them by God. One must imagine them happy. I might not be doing it, but someone who's willing to take these days, even weeks or months to do so, and then condense it down to just 10 or 15 minutes, is exactly where we have an overlap in pretty disparate interests, where I can find what I truly love in what someone else does. Through the effort of sharing these videos in a polished and entertaining form, I was provided the inspiration to write something overly serious and absolutely silly about something I never would have imagined. A new framework for ideas bouncing around in my head and needing somewhere to go, like guests between a ride exit and a hot dog stall. The only way you get such a cool overlap like this is when you cast off the limits and say, why not? What's stopping me? Stop being limited by these false things and to start finding and choosing our own to be pressed against. After all, if I'd never considered what the real limits of a body are, if I just accepted what I was told they were without question, well, I wouldn't be me. If I just accepted what my parents always said, that YouTube was a scam and the internet was all danger, that I'd never have had this chance to do something that I actually love with my life. With someone else's limits like that, how could I have ever been me? Yes, this was a video about a silly game, about making a silly park with silly rides, but almost everything around us is created by human minds and human experience. And if someone can make a game based around this principle, then how much else is it based around? Societies like this aren't just the way things are, it's the way that we chose things are so long ago that we now feel that's how things are. And so we have to consider our identities, our roles, our connections, and more. Are they the same way? Are they limited like that? Or are we just letting them be limited? And if they are, why are they? Is it just or unjust? The small cracks now in these silly ways that introduce us to the concept make the necessary larger breaks later possible. But this is where we pause and add a bit of nuance, because for as important as this all is, there's a caveat. We can't do it all the time. If we're always chasing the limits, then all the space behind us, all the space we gained from doing so, starts to mean nothing. I didn't have this in the video originally, but when speaking with Marcel for this video, I asked, now that you are so knowledgeable on how to exploit the game, do you find regular play any less fun? And his response was about how some time ago, only playing the game for those hyper-optimized setups for videos actually did lead to him getting burned out on the game, playing it not for fun, but pretty much just to produce content. And what brought him back was streaming more regular parks, just sharing the fun of the game as is with people, a more easy and accessible experience than exploits. From that basis, he refound an appreciation for the game and is still streaming twice a week like that right now. I think this is where some of his best videos have came from as well, like this one, just building a cursed park. It takes cheats and exploits and the like and uses them not for some grand end goal, but just to have a fun in a bit of a wilder way than the game intended. And that just makes sense, right? Part of the point of these experiments is for their own sake, because that alone is very amazing, but also they mean a lot more if you use them afterwards as a piece of something else, because that gives them a greater life than just one setup. If you place a few of the exploit adjacent micro coasters throughout your park to lessen the difficulty a bit because you don't like straight sandbox, but also don't enjoy the more challenging parks, then that's just this experimental pushing of limits allowing you to have fun in a better way. If you're building a park and you have a good laugh from ditching guests into the void for having the audacity to go into a one-tile maze, then that's limit pushing making your time more enjoyable. We have to remember this, that if we're simply chasing the most meaningful things all the time, then they lose their luster by becoming the only things. They need the context of relaxation, of fun, of more simple joys and times to remain as something so stunning. For every great setup or exploit video, a few great simply playing ones go a long way. Sometimes it's just a game from over 20 years ago, and that's still pretty cool. And so I really do appreciate the absurdity of RollerCoaster Tycoon that Marcel shows, but also the simplicity and enjoyability of it as is too, and even more the work to share all of that with us. So thank you for that, and thank you for watching. I hope I'll see you again soon.